If one were to look outside the 2024 election, they might think that gun control is one of the most contentious topics in the United States. And one might be forgiven if they fall into the trap of being invited into a conversation about the subject. See, the idea, this invitation of inviting someone to a conversation, oftentimes sets the stage for an urgency, as if something needs to be discussed about a thing, while the person inviting those to the stage is most oftentimes the least qualified person to be there. So be careful when you hear the siren song of being invited to have a conversation about something without making an evaluation of who is doing the inviting. And that is the subject of today, which is how topics like gun control oftentimes falsely set the stage with an invitation that their goal is the same as your goal. And the problem that we want to solve is not the political solution, which we'll get to very quickly, but rather we want to look at how we can reduce violence ethically. It's not good enough to just claim that we want to reduce violence, because you can do that with hyperbolic solutions like eliminating all mankind, or making everybody a drone, or removing their element of free will. But those concerns trickle down into the things that motivate us, because a life without agency, with the ability to act and make decisions, really doesn't seem like much of a life at all. And that is the heart of what we are going to be talking about today on the Redacted Culture Cast, which, if you've been around for a while, know that I like to delve into the ideas behind why we believe what we believe, like things such as the Second Amendment. See, that piece of paper with that very legendary writing might sound important to us, but if we don't know why we believe it and where it comes from and how we got here, then most likely, if we are finding ourselves in the situation where we have to use forced to defend our lives, we may find ourselves morally compromised. Now that word salad of an entry is over, this is a gun control element, or a gun culture element, and as a result, I want to introduce our sponsor for today's episode, which is Obsidian Arms. Now, if you go into the link below, or the description below, you can find a discount code for 10% off of what you are going to purchase from, or what you might want from Obsidian Arms. So you can use that, but what are you looking for? Now, they have toolkits, punches, and firearm-specific kits that help build your self-sufficiency, whether you're adding them to your workbench or to your go bag. But to go a little bit further, if you're getting ready for the competition season this year, well, at least this summer in the cold regions of the country, if you're looking to get ready for competition, whether now or in the upcoming season, go and look at some of their gear, because they might be exactly what you're looking for. And finally, if you've got an idea that you've been working on, drawing it out, mapping it out, presenting, trying to figure out how it's going to fit into the market, and you're looking for a manufacturer, particularly for metal goods that require precision, and you might be surprised how many items in your safe are already made by them, but go ahead and check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com, and don't forget to check the description below. Now, what is the goal here? The goal is presented pragmatically, is that we want to reduce violence. We want to reduce violence ethically. In the United States, that is so oftentimes attributed to us, is mass shootings. See, we don't have the same self-deleting explodey problem as other parts of the world, and if we were to zoom out of just the United States, we might look at different countries and recognize each one has their different patterns, and we might have to ask, why are they such? Is it politics? Is it economics? Or is it culture? Or, which we're going to ultimately have to realize, very much so, is it nature or is it nurture, that we're going to run into all three. See, politics influences economics by the policies that are made by those who are in power. Economics affects culture by people putting their money where their mouth is. And culture affects politics by they vote for what they will either support or what they will most tolerate. And this diagram goes the opposite direction, because politicians, by their very nature of having to do with laws, have set some precedent over what belief systems are or are not acceptable in their countries. And culture or philosophy affects economics in the same way, where people put their money where their mouth is, or what they believe in inspires them to spend their money somewhere. And then economics will affect politics in its worst way, with, say, bribery or maybe lobbying, but also the ways that people can support those that in democratic institutions, supposedly, they want to be representing them before their government. And all three of these work together in what we're talking about. But let's start with politics, the easy one, the easiest stone to throw for those who live in glass houses. The recent election of Donald Trump and the defeat or the loss by Kamala Harris needs to be studied, I believe. I think it ought to be studied in any sort of political philosophy course that's rigorous in any way, shape, or form in the coming years. Because at the end of the Trump campaign, at the end of the 2020 election season, both candidates decided to make public appearances on new media, on podcasts and different shows of sorts, outside of the norm of the big cable news networks. And it worked very well for Donald Trump, but it didn't work out as well for Kamala Harris. And while Donald Trump's appearances on Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and Sean Ryan and so on and so forth, or even J.D. Vance to a secondary extent, made those politicians seem more relatable and seem more consistent, it had the opposite effect for Kamala Harris. And the best example within the framework of the gun culture is that when she began to talk about assault weapons bans, it was so unpopular that she flip-flopped so quickly to talk about the firearms that she owned. Famously, I have a Glock. Whether or not it's a Glock is to be in question. And then there's also there's the secondary element of, but you live in California and there's a registry, and this sounds a lot like, guns for me, but not for thee. But that illustrated just how unpopular the subject was. And if where we're at right now in our part in the timeline, and we get to say, well, at least of that triad, politics, economics, and philosophy, or politics, economics, and culture, that politics is sort of maybe quiet. It's the other two places we can put our effort, or we can wield the other two to influence politics more effectively. But it's not politics alone that's going to reduce violence in the United States, because what we have come to find out, both in the long term and the short term, is that short-sighted solutions attempting to reduce violence often beget more violence. I began with a bit of a caricature at the beginning. Sure, if we eliminated all people of a certain demographic that statistically do more of the violence, we could reduce the amount of violence that we experience that takes place in the United States. But we would have to come to the conclusion that that is not an ethical solution, because it is going to discriminate on the basis of race, perhaps sex, or religion in that sense, although we need to get into that more in the future rather quickly. But the hyperbole would be, if we were to say, again, lobotomize everybody, that might reduce the amount of violence that continues after, but you have to assert great violence to make it accomplished. And so if we're trying to reduce the violence in the United States, we can't simply have that goal uber alles. Hat tip. But in the short term, we also see what people oftentimes do when it comes to firearms acquisition. Now, the gun culture, the firearms industry, and the average firearm owner might be considered different groups or camps depending on how you look at it. But what we oftentimes see is that people acquire firearms when they are in response to something, whether it's a threat. And we saw this represented not characteristically, but most at the largest scale that we've witnessed in most of our lifetimes in 2020, when you had a combination of riots, economic concerns over COVID, as well as governmental control concerns over COVID, and the political cycle of an election season coming to a conclusion all at the same time. See, in 2020, there were more firearms sold by firearms or FFL organizations than, or FFL's gun stores, than any time before in recorded American history, and it wasn't by a short amount. If I recall, more firearms were sold in the United States between June and July of 2020 than the entire previous year. So 2019 might have had some, but if I'm not mistaken, more firearms were sold between June and July, or maybe June and August of 2020 than the entire year before. So and it didn't slow down as precipitously as was concerned. And so what that illustrates, though, then is that oftentimes the purchasing of firearms itself is done as a response to either a threat or a concern of something like that. We're seeing this being replicated in our current day as Trump is approaching Inauguration Day, and already on the Platform X, you can find groups of people, and I'm sure you can find it on Blue Sky, but I don't go there because and Reddit also has its own illustrations of it. You have people on the left organizing, to what extent that's solid, over buying firearms and becoming proficient with them, and we wouldn't call them NRA supporters by any stretch of the means. But speaking of the NRA, let's talk about culture and the contributing factors that create or inspire or are consistent for violence in the United States. The old paradigm oftentimes, or the old paradigm, and I think one good example of it might be Bring the War Home, is a book by, was it Kathleen Kennedy? No. What was her name? Whatever. I read it a couple years ago. Is that you have this sort of the old paradigm, and I'm using the Thomas Kuhn reference of paradigm. If you are familiar with his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and if you haven't read it, you should. It's quite fantastic. But the old paradigm of violence in our society was oftentimes disparate racial or ethnic groups. And there was this violence between maybe political parties or then ethical groups, or say different populations. The Irish and the Italians, you could say blacks and whites, the Deep South. You could talk about different refugee populations, the Somalis, the Hmong, the whatever. A lot of this paradigm was completely rooted in ethnic identities first. But what we look at when we look at across the whole, when we look at instances of violence, particularly extruded violence or larger scale violence in the United States, the individuals perpetuating the violence typically fall under a certain category, and that is that they have no family. You might have heard the absentee fathers argument, but I think we've even gone deeper than that with organizations like Black Lives Matter arguing for the abolition of the family unit. So let's start with a talk about boomers and how we got here, because that will illustrate the path on how we go out the other way, how we get away from the whiplash of that pendulum between catastrophe and overt optimism, back to catastrophe, back to optimism, and instead stabilize that swinging pendulum to move in the direction that we want it to go. Now, as I said a second ago, let's talk about boomers. The boomer generation, when it comes to gun culture, is almost entirely defined by the NRA. This isn't exactly an honest description of them, but it's how so many think of that generation, oftentimes by opposition, not by those steeped within the firearms industry. I grew up in a rural part of the country where most of the men that I knew that either hunted or had some form of concealed carry might have had a membership to the NRA, but it certainly wasn't the thing that they woke up to and was informed about every single thing and every time. A lot of what they came out of, or what their experiences were driven by, was a little bit of NRA over here, a little bit of what's going on in their community, a little bit in their interests, whether it was in World War II firearms or historic pieces or learning to hunt better or shoot competition, or insert all these other interests below. But we have to use the NRA as the whipping boy for the sake of this next element, because the NRA's influence and perhaps the boomer generation's interest in, or not interest, but appreciation, love for President Reagan also sets the stage on how short-term victories, or even Pyrrhic victories, ended up becoming defeats. And don't worry, we're going to get back to the cue the Fast and the Furious meme family back in a second. But the NRA generation is oftentimes referred to by the younger generations as the FUDs, and they are people who are unwilling to change with the times. So if you are of that older cast and you are thinking, oh, you know, these young kids with their gun culture and their black t-shirts with their logos and their lasers and night vision and suppressors and silencers, you don't need any of that. You just need your trusty 1911 Remington 700, 870, whatever. Just go back in history and you are repeating song. I recall hearing a story of referencing this perpetual cycle of old versus new, where the redcoats did not like the American Kentucky rifle, or they did not like the American rifles because they were a weak man's gun. That their projectile was too small and the gun was too hard to load. You don't need those fancy gizmos. We've got our trusty smoothbore Brown Bess. You don't need that rifling. That is one example of how we have seen if you go back through gun culture over time, there is generation after generation after generation that looks at whatever came next as inferior to whatever they had. You know, the M14 was better than the AR-15. You could even go back, the M14 or the M1 Garand was better than the AR, and the Springfield 1903 was better than the Enfield, and the blah, 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 blah. There's a meme about it somewhere, but the attitude that has most prevailed from the FUD or the boomer generation is perhaps a little bit in meme form, is you don't need those fancy black rifles. And I hate to inform you that that attitude does more damage than it does good, because yes, we might go onto the internet and find all these horrible examples of young people doing dumb things. But remember, your feed is curated to bait you into rage, not to see what people are actually doing. And so Reagan, the beloved patron saint of the boomer generation, wasn't the best for gun culture when it came to his policies. He was responsible, or participated in, the Mulford Act in California, which banned Californians from open carrying a loaded firearm. He had involvement in the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, which, while is touted as one of the most one of the broadest repealing reforms of the Gun Control Act, also brought in the legislation which made it increasingly difficult for the average citizen to own or even understand a fully automatic firearm, unless you live in the inner city. They still got them. It's still not legal. And then the Firearms Owner Protection Act of 1986 set the groundwork for the assault weapons ban, which, the reports that I've read, Ronald Reagan was in support of in 1994. And so what does this mean? It means that if we are going to look back to the prior generation, there are things that we are going to want to hold on to. They held on to the spirit of competition, the idea of hunting and conservation. The boomer generation brought so much to the firearms industry and the gun culture, but it's not that we want everything to stay, because out of the boomer generation came the suicide problem, and with the suicide epidemic, if that's what we want to use the word, that is inflicting itself across so many millennials today, which leads to, where does this violence come from? See, if you look at the statistics of firearms deaths every year, if you're listening on the left, you're going to get a number somewhere in the 30 to 40,000s. You're going to get this massive number about the amount of people that have been killed by firearms in the last year. And then if you hear it from the right, they're going to make a quick statement saying, but how many of those are suicides? And so, and then you might also hear that we've had this many mass shootings this last year, and that will be responded to by, yes, but the definition of mass shooting continuously changes to be more advantageous for those who want your types of actions, even though they're going to have no meaningful effect on our culture. But what if I told you that, what if we took a minute to, instead of pissing back and forth over the nuances of suicide versus mass shooting versus gang violence, instead we looked at the idea itself, what are the contributing factors that have led so many people to either remove themselves from the environment or take out their anger on others, whether it's a directed perceived enemy like the Nashville shooter a couple of years ago, or what we might have seen in Wisconsin a couple months ago now. It's a month ago now. Is it some sort of ideological difference, or is there something else at play? And whether or not we're talking about suicide or mass shootings, one of the key elements is isolation. And there are a number of contributing factors that have led to the isolation of individuals these days. One of them might be the internet itself. People who are terminally online, constantly reading, being consumed by these theories and ideas that reorient the world into some sort of Gnostic truth where they have the enlightenment because they figured out the thing, only to be manipulated by some sort of character or motive that they're just not aware of. I brought up the book multiple times. It's Jamil Javini's Why Young Men, and he illustrates on how disaffected young men in Toronto were sort of captivated by those who recruited them into domestic terrorism or even foreign terrorism. The city of Minneapolis was the first city in the United States to have young men recruited from a school not from school, but from a city in Minneapolis to go fight on behalf of ISIS. And as we've seen recently, ISIS might not be as gone as we thought they were. But the key element, whether it comes to suicide or it comes to or these acts of violence, is oftentimes isolation, whether it's self-induced or otherwise. Now, some might be quick to jump onto the bandwagon of bullying, but bullying has been around for a long time, and it's only recently that we've witnessed this level of violence. Another issue, or not level, this publicity of violence is probably the more accurate description. So what we run into, and when we track incidents of violence, we can look at multiple different demographics, we can look at multiple different factors, but one consistent issue that we find is that it's isolation. Now, that isolation may come about by political means, political parties running on ideologies that ultimately paint the individual as a victim, that they are an isolated individual who is being attacked by the system, and the only choice that they have, the only recourse that they have, is violence. Or it might come from economic situations where those who have been on hard times for a long enough time feel like they can't do it anymore and they choose to remove themselves from the situation. Or it might come from cultural issues where the fringes of multiculturalism, or the influence of multiculturalism has placed everybody on the fringe instead of in some sort of melting pot as it promised to, and now you have people who are disconnected from their churches, their synagogues, and their communities. their churches, their religious institutions, even and they find something else to fill that void. So when we track incidents of violence, we might also want to bring up this idea of gang violence. But what is a gang other than an artificial or a chosen family? The gun culture oftentimes plays off of tropes of the gang idea, or young men might read books by Jack Donovan. The Way of Men is the Way of the Gang, the title of the book of The Way of Men, and they might be influenced by that. Jack Donovan's been a friend of the show before, and I'm glad to have him on. But the influence and the illustration of what we've been running into in here is that the most likely predictor, or the most common element across populations of the instigation of violence, is not itself access to firearms, but it is isolation from our families, from our churches, and so forth. And this illustrates, in order to address what that has looked like in our lives, I want to talk about a couple things that have come from sort of the boomer FUD generation that have trickled down into our day and age when it comes to the gun culture. While on the larger scale, we might come to the conclusion that if we can take active steps to be less isolated, we ourselves will be less likely to participate in acts of violence. There was an episode we recorded with Ethan Walters a while ago, it was sometime last year, that talked about how there was a gentleman who was arrested for threatening online. He was online threatening the life of, is it now former President Joe Biden? Whatever. And the question was, where was his people? Where were his friends or his community to come around and say, hey man, it's probably not a good idea. Instead, he was left alone in the wind and got wrapped up for it. And so in this conversation about how we might reduce violence ethically in the United States, or at least in our world, we had to deal with how politics, economics, and culture were connected, or politics, economics, and philosophy for those who wanted to go down that road, and how not any one of those can itself be a complete solution, unless you're going to take the idea of metaphysics and move on from there, but let's not. So not any one of those alone can be a complete solution. The culture we need to have some influence and participation in culture. There's going to be some economic responsibility and participation involved. And then finally, politics, even though where we're at, it's not very popular to support gun control, we are going to have to consider how we live in the body politic, as we might phrase it. So starting with the easiest one, politics is going to affect economy. And the example of this can be demonstrated in the ATF brace ruling, which had a massive economic impact on the firearms industry and the gun culture by the amount of money that people had to spend already in a time that it was economically difficult for those to we were already dealing with an economically difficult time. You had the brace ruling, which came out, which not only affected the individual citizen who was suddenly concerned over what they can and cannot own, or what they have in their gun safe is now legal, and with all the myriad of confusions involved in that, but it also impacted your gun stores, because how much of their supply, how much of their inventory did they just have to take off the shelf or figure out how to alter in order to make it sellable again? And then the manufacturers themselves, which at the time, a braced pistol was quite possibly the most popular firearm being sold. And so politics, if we want to address it on the political level, we have to recognize that politics itself is not going to be the solution, and the solutions that it represents are going to have consequences economically and otherwise. The second one is, if we're going to address economics, how we are going to reduce violence, as we were talking here, is that if we need to put our money where our mouth is, do we support the events? Do we even financially support the events, or go to the things that we want to? Or also, maybe let's flip that idea on its head. Perhaps it's not so bad that your buddy wants to build a new plate carrier, or he's spending a little bit of money to buy a new pouch, so that he can figure out what he's doing next in his next activity, whether it's milsim or airsoft or just community participation. I have seen more guys get together to talk about gear, whether it's fishing gear, motorcycle gear, or firearms gear, or golf or hobby sports, and this is just another example of how people do it. Now, you could say that it has a little bit more utilitarian value than the others. A golf club is only as effective as, if you've got golf arenas, what do you call them? Golf fields? Somebody who plays golf will yell at me for this. Golf courses, there it is. But this attitude that every single element of purchasing and figuring out whether it's LARPing or otherwise is inherently negative, that attitude is self-defeating at best, because you're going to exchange the short-term victory of your haha, I'm better than you, for the lack of participation in the very thing that keeps your interests and your not even hobbies, but your passions, the things that you're interested in, alive. If boomers didn't buy surplus firearms, there wouldn't be surplus firearms for you to try to afford. Ouch. But the topic I have continued to drill down most importantly on this subject is how we think about it, and that is culture. See, there are some vestiges from the boomer generation that aren't exactly great. One of them is that we treat everybody as if they're an idiot. Another one is that you can only participate in something like competition shooting if you are as passionate about my brand of the Second Amendment as anybody else. Perhaps the true value of the Second Amendment was the friends we made along the way. As much as that meme is hilarious and tiring, if you want to go shoot competition, you don't need to justify it with some grandiose example of how it's defending your right to bear arms by going and blasting at some paper targets. Go shoot competition and, like me, get schooled by some grandmaster who's hilarious on YouTube or whatever he's doing. So if you want to go shoot competition, it doesn't have to come with some overarching moral triumph. Go learn to shoot, get better at it. And finally, the last thing, and I think the last thing that we can address as a culture, which isn't so much this call for us, because we can hear it across the country and the community, that there's this desire for people to have community with one another. Maybe it's time for us to participate in the genuine act of suicide prevention by going out, meeting people, and taking a little bit of risk getting to know them. Now, before you say, hold on, Fed boy, you're glowing right now, and I promise you what I'm trying to get at there is, I have observed this attitude time and time again, which perpetuates the isolation of our community. And that isn't necessarily the dick measuring, I'm cooler than you, I've got better gear than you, therefore I'm higher in the hierarchy, or the hierarchy, whatever. What I continuously have found is that those people over there are dumb, so I will not have anything to do with them. I've noticed this pattern, having moved out to Arizona with going out and shooting on public land, is that if you go during the wrong times of the weekend, you're going to encounter, different types of people. Some of them might be a father teaching his daughter how to shoot, or a man looking for brass, or, a bunch of young kids up to no good that are not really very good at what they're doing, and they're mimicking hood activities or whatever their versions of it is. And while I understand how that might look like it gives us a bad image, they also are encouraged to act that way by constantly being shoved out. Now, I would be remiss to admit that Reddit is the gathering place of the rejects of the gun culture, and some people get rejected because they just do. But the interesting point about this, and the thing that's developed over time on this subject, is that just because, even though most of the annoying people that you've met in the gun culture carry a certain gun, it doesn't mean that everyone who has that gun fits that stereotype. kind of weird. But it's if I want to rag on the Springfield XD for a while, it's not that the Springfield XD itself is an inherently bad gun. It's that for some reason, a bunch of people who are unbearable in public decided that that was going to be their poster child firearm, and they took it to the internet and decided that it was the best thing since sliced bread, and all it did was push people away. And yes, some people are socially awkward, and some people need to learn a lesson or two. But coming together and making this point in conclusion, as kumbaya as it sounds, if we look at the leading contributing factors to violence, whether against oneself or against other people, is isolation. And if we are going to hold on to this vestigial attitude from previous generations that approaches everybody else in the firearms or the gun culture as absolute idiots, I've been yelled at by more people wearing NRA hats than anything else, even though pretty sure a flight of stairs would have killed them, or, you know, if their pacemaker shut off for 30 seconds or whatever. But despite that fact, despite that issue, if we give up on the gun culture and the people in our community, we ourselves are a contributing factor to those who find themselves recruited by terrorism, recruited by government agencies, or take themselves out of the equation. And that may sound, again, like the solution to our problems is the power of friendship. Cue anime music in the background. However, if you can hear me out, go out and spend some time with people. Even if it means, hey, dude, I just want to see your gear and hang out in that way. Go out and spend some time with people, whether that's shooting goofy videos or learning how to do something new. Go out and spend some time with people, whether it's at a competition, at a convention, at a community meeting. If you are concerned about the security of your church, spend time with some other men. And remember, you may think you're approaching this from a calm, cool, and collective position, but they might be observing you as you're at an 11 out of 10, and you need to chill out, man. If you're going to if you are in that intel kind of community, incremental introduction is probably the best choice. But if you've got some ideas on how you can build community and spend time with one another and continue to build this culture up from the ground up, leave that in the comment below. Otherwise, if you want to get a hold of us, you can head over to Instagram, and we are at Redacted LLC. If you're coming from Instagram, you know how to get a hold of me. In 2024, we put on 4 public land cleanups in Arizona and Utah. Our goal for 2025 is to double that at least. Now, if we could break free from all of our other work type environments and do both this gun culture podcast and the public land cleanups full time, we would do so in a heartbeat. But this has been a slow growing project. So if you are in the United States and you have public land near you where people like to shoot and they tend to trash it, leave that in the comment below, and maybe we can schedule one for the coming months. We'd love to meet more of you. I'd like to get out of the house more, and if we can show the demand there, then perhaps the economy, this firearms industry, can support us too. That also being the case, if you want to support us directly, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. Any donations that you make over there, whether it's a monthly membership or a one-time, that goes to supporting our public land cleanups as well. So if you want to support us, head over to redactedculture.locals.com. And if you are trying to create events because we've got more, or you would like see if we could be showing up in your area, go ahead and leave a comment below on a public land area near you that needs cleaning, and we'll add it to the docket and see if we can fit it in the calendar. Well, that has been the case. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We went a little bit longer today than usual, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your listening. Now go forth and conquer.